Hello everyone, this is Thambi Medapala. In this video, I would like to discuss about the high altitude physiology of training. So the training can be improved with the high altitude application. So that is what I would like to discuss in this video. So let us see what are the types of altitudes. There are three varieties of altitude that we usually go through as far physiology is concerned. And in fact, this high altitude subject is fall under applied exercise physiology, where we can manipulate the subject's ability or players ability or athlete's ability to achieve the goal or to improve the performance. As we know, the oxygen is one of the very essential element which is 100% supportive to the life. If there is no oxygen on the atmosphere, it's certain that there is no life. So the life is purely depends on the oxygen. So atmosphere on the earth, surface of the earth, supposedly this is the earth. On surface we have different layers of the atmosphere. If you look at from the space, this complete layer is appears to be a blue color because of atmosphere. So this is atmosphere. Because of atmosphere, the earth looks a bluish color from the space. No other planet in our solar system looks like blue, because there is no atmosphere elsewhere on the solar system apart from the earth. So this atmosphere is consisting of different elements. So the main element, one of the essential element, is oxygen, which is present approximately 20 to 21% of total elements in the atmosphere. We have nitrogen. The majority contribution is made by our nitrogen, and minimal contribution by inert gases, and we have of course carbon dioxide, also one of the important element, which is approximately 0.04% on atmosphere. So this is basic atmospheric composition, gas composition on the atmosphere. And as far altitude is concerned, we have three levels of altitude: high altitude, very high altitude, and extreme altitudes. So high altitude, when we look at the high altitude, it is considered to be 1500 meters to 3500 meters. If the altitude from the earth, so this is the beginning altitude, so this is high altitude, comes under high altitude, which falls from 15 to 3500 meters. If you go for the altitude from 3500 to 5500 meter, considered to be a very high altitude, and beyond 5500 meters it is considered to be a extreme altitude, where the existence of life is very challenging. So this is about different altitudes. And usually, as for players concerned, we work with the 2500 meters to 3500 meters. This is approximate range of altitude where the players are essentially exposed to the low oxygen levels in order to improve the performance. So apparently the oxygen concentration, the percentage of oxygen is 20 at the sea level or at the surface of atmosphere, at the surface of earth. As you ascend further and further towards the extreme altitude, the percentage gradually drops, right? So 2500 meters to 3500 meters approximately, we may having 14 to 12% of oxygen saturation. So this is the normal saturation, This is not a saturation, per fractional oxygen percentage. The oxygen content can be 14 to 12% from 2500 meters to the 3000 meters altitude from the earth. So let us see what is again different levels where the oxygen saturation triggers the physiological response, the oxygen concentration. So for example, the 2000 meters to 2500 meters is optimum training range. For beginners, we usually expose them to this altitude and up to 3500 meters. So at initial level of training, initial level of exposure of any player begins from 2000 meters, where the oxygen drop is very minimal. The oxygen concentration drop is very minimal, so that therefore the player can sustain to the low oxygen levels. So further, we may expose the players, depends on the adaptations, up to 3500 meters as training go on. So here 5000 meters and above is extremely dangerous and potentially a negative effect is seen on the health. So therefore the optimal or the best zone of high altitude training is 2000 to 3500 meters. So in this link you can go through partial pressure of oxygen dissociation curve. Means the amount of oxygen being bound to the hemoglobin with the different altitude. You can put the altitude level and see what would be the saturation of oxygen with the hemoglobin, that is PaO2. Yes, in terms of we can also see SpO2, that is peripheral saturation of oxygen, but particularly we say it is PaO2, partial pressure of oxygen in arterial blood. So there is a curve, oxygen dissociation curve, OCD, oxygen dissociation curve. So here we may have the hemoglobin oxygen, 100% oxygen, here 100% bound hemoglobin. So there would be a curve, S-shaped curve. This is called oxygen dissociation curve, ODC, oxygen dissociation curve. You may go through this link as well as some videos in YouTube for further details of oxygen dissociation curve. So this is a hypoxic chamber, how it looks like. So in Patiala we have hypoxic chamber. The volume of hypoxic chamber is 90 cubic meters, the total volume of chamber, and we have one monitor here. We can notice the monitor where we can manipulate or modulate different altitudes. The minimum altitude starts from 2000 meters. The maximum altitude is ending at 6000 meters. This is the capacity of the hypoxic chamber, which is there in the Patiala Center, which is dedicated to Department of Exercise Physiology. And so once we set the 2000 altitude or any altitude in the monitor, so this entire room, itself becomes a hypoxic chamber. So this 90 cubic meters room becomes complete hypoxic chamber. As we ascend the higher and higher, the oxygen decreases its percentage. So from here at sea level, approximately in Patiala we have 3000 meters altitude. where we see approximately 20% of oxygen percentage fractional oxygen concentration in the atmosphere. If you ascend 6,000 meters, that may decreases around 9 to 8% of oxygen concentration from here to here. So this is how, as we ascend from sea level to high altitude, this is this chamber having, as I said, 6,000 meters altitude. So at 6,000 meters altitude, you may have the oxygen concentration around 8 to 9% from 20 at the sea level. And we have small gadgets here. This gadget is known as oxygen sensor, which sense the oxygen concentration inside the room. And this sensor is carbon dioxide sensor, which sense the carbon dioxide concentration, presence of carbon dioxide, even at the parts per million. So these two sensors are very accurate and very sensitive, which sense the oxygen and as well as carbon dioxide concentrations inside the room, so that it maintains the standard or desired oxygen levels inside the room, depends on the altitude that we set. So the altitude can ascend as high as 6,000 meters. So everything, the hypoxic chamber can be manipulated or monitored by through this the gadget. This is the simple tab like gadget where we can see complete applications of hypoxic chamber training. So this is the machinery of hypoxic chamber, which is there just behind this room, and I would like to explain what are these contents gadgets. So this is a compressor. So the compressor compresses the air molecules, so it completely compresses the air molecule, and then it goes to the dryer. This is the dryer. So the dryer completely dry the air molecule and eliminate the dust as well as carbon dioxide. So it dries, eliminate the dust and carbon dioxide. So the main function of the dryer. So this is the dryer, this is the compressor, and then we have pressurized vessels here, and this pressurized air goes into the these two filters. There are two filters here. This is one filter, this is second filter. So these filters exclusively filters the oxygen. It eliminates the complete oxygen. It therefore it extract the nitrogen from the atmosphere. As we know, we have 78% nitrogen in the atmosphere. So these filters filters 100% nitrogen. So therefore they eliminate the oxygen from the atmospheric air. And here we have one panel. So this panel is a controlling panel which controls the complete system, depends on the altitude. For example, I set the 2500 meters altitude from the monitor, from the room, hypoxic chamber room. So at this altitude, the oxygen concentration supposedly around 14%, right? So this 14 or 15%. So this percentage to be maintained inside this room. So this 14 or 15% of oxygen to be maintained depends on the altitude. Suppose I set the 2500 meters altitude. So what happens, this 100% nitrogen is being mixed with the normal atmospheric air here. So in the top there is a fan like system which mixes the atmospheric air with the 100% nitrogen, and depends on the oxygen requirement. So it sends inside the room the mixed air will sense inside the room, so that the room maintains 14% of oxygen concentration. So therefore room completely maintains the required amount of oxygen. Therefore the room becomes oxygen chamber. Now this becomes the simulated oxygen, artificial oxygen hypoxic chamber or artificial hypoxic chamber. So this is how the screen, usually screen looks like 350 meters altitude at the sea level, where we can able to see the oxygen concentration is 20%, carbon dioxide concentration is ppm is 181, which is equivalent to 0.04%. 20% is oxygen. So this is at a normal level when the altitude chamber or hypoxic chamber at resting state or off state. So in fact this monitor will continuously monitor the oxygen levels inside the room. As and when you switch on the chamber or set the altitude, required altitude, automatically the chamber becomes the required altitude chamber. Supposedly I put the 2500, it becomes 2500 here. So the saturation becomes, the partial pressure or oxygen concentration becomes 14%. And now the chamber is being utilized by the players for their general training purpose. These players belongs to the wushu game, so they usually performs some general kind of training in the hypoxic chamber at the morning time. So this was the training protocol photo that we obtained during their training schedule. And now the oxygen, the hypoxic chamber was put on 4500 meters. This was the altitude, and we can see here the oxygen concentration falls 11.5% from 20. So this is a room, this is a normal sea level altitude, this is at 4500 meters, right? So and the partial pressure, the carbon dioxide concentration also can be seen here at 638 ppm, and this is the pulse oximetry, where we can record SpO2, partial pressure of oxygen saturation in the peripheral blood. So my the partial pressure here is 73. The saturation of oxygen with the hemoglobin is 73. Usually the normal should lie from 99 to 98% of oxygen saturation. This is the pulse oximetry, where we recorded the SpO2 falls 73 instead of 98. 98 it is normal. At 4500 the saturation drops at 73%, whereas heart rate is 108. This is the heart rate and oxygen saturation being recorded by pulse oximetry at the 4500 meter altitude with 11.5% of oxygen content in the room, hypoxic chamber. This is what about the technicality of hypoxic chamber. So the technical aspects of hypoxic chamber, then we'll see different training protocols, principles of hypoxic chamber, altitude training. We have major two varieties of trainings. One is live high, train low. Second is live high, train high. So live high, train high means the person has to stay in high altitude, natural high altitude or hypoxic chamber 24/7. So this is natural, this is hypoxic chamber. So altitude stay should be 24/7, where the person stays continuously with training also. Training plus stay together at the altitude. It can be natural, it can be artificial. This is known as live high, train high. And second one is live high, train low. So that means the person has to stay in the hypoxic chamber for the overnight, 8 to 12 hours of overnight stay in the hypoxic chamber or natural altitude. Stay at the natural altitude, whereas training to be trained under the sea level. So training to be at sea level and stay to be at high altitude. So that is hypoxic chamber, that is artificial, or it can be natural altitude. So this is the difference between the live high, train low and live high, train high. And coming to the physiological implications, what kind of physiology would bring about increasing the performance in the players? So the physiological implications mainly seen in the increasing the aerobic capacity of the player, right? So increasing VO2 max. So how VO2 max being increased upon the hypoxic training? So here the performance of an athlete can be increased, particularly endurance performance, by high altitude training, because they can able to consume more oxygen upon the hypoxic training. So before hypoxic training, what we do, actually we take the all essential physiological parameters before the training, and after training again we'll take the same parameters, and we see what kind of percentage of change that occurred upon the exposure of hypoxic training. So that is how we see the change of physiology would increases their performance, particularly middle and long distance players or endurance players, right? So this is how the hypoxic training implication can be benefited to the players or improvement of the performance. So mostly the high altitude exposure triggers the erythropoietin secretion. So the erythropoietin is one of the essential hormones secreting from kidney and liver and elsewhere of the body, majority by the kidney and liver. So this erythropoietin, what it does is actually stimulates the erythropoiesis. So the production of RBCs increases upon the exposure of altitude. Altitude training, where we exposing the low oxygen concentrations, which triggers the erythropoietin secretion, which stimulates the RBC production, so that increases the RBC levels in the blood, therefore increases the HB, so therefore increases the oxygen carrying capacity in the blood, so that increasing the endurance performance. This is how the physiology actually plays a critical role in the improvement of the performance upon the exposure of the high altitude. So that is how the high altitude can be benefited for the an athlete or a player. And the overall advantages or disadvantages of hypoxic training or high altitude training is seen in this slide. So increase free fatty acid mobilization, increase hemoglobin, increase capillary density, oxidative enzymes activity, increase mitochondrial volume. These are the beneficial of benefits of high altitude training or exposure of high altitude training. So one can ask how many days are required to improvement of the performance. So usually we prefer 30 days of regular training, 30 days of exposure. It can be overnight exposure or it can be regular training exposure. So we have two varieties of training regimes in as far hypoxic training is concerned. One is active training, second one is passive training. So exposure of hypoxic training, the hypoxic training of 30 days, it can be passive or it can be active. Passive training means the player supposedly live in the altitude chamber of 8 to 12 hours a day. Simply the player has to sleep or stay without any activity up to 12 hours a day. That means overnight a day up to 30 days. Right, this comes under passive training. And second one is active training up to 1 to 1.5 hour, 1.5 hour training, regular training per day for 30 days comes under active training. Active means regular training inside the chamber. This passive means regular exposure without training in the chamber. Up to 30 days we can see improvement of the performance. So in overall, beneficial of hypoxic training can be up to 2% in elite players. So the benefit improvement of the overall performance from 1 to 2% in elite players. So that this is all about the hypoxic training benefit in elite player. It can be varied person to the person. So hypoxic training is purely individualized. The benefit of the hypoxic training can be varied from person to person. The maximum benefit of overall improvement of performance can be up to 2%. And clinical implications, if you expose beyond the range of high altitude suddenly, all of suddenly, without any training, without any prior exposure, so that triggers high altitude mountain sickness, cerebral edema, pulmonary edema, reduction of the muscle mass and all. So these are the clinical implications of high altitude exposure, sudden exposure without any prior acclimatization. In conclusion, high altitude training definitely improve the performance in majority cases. Therefore, the altitude training should be considered following the parameters, the state of an athlete, type of game or sports the person is engaging with, and competition time and complications of high altitude to be known by the technical person who is accompanying with the athlete. That means the athlete has to be monitored continuously during the exposure of high altitude in the hypoxic chamber or natural altitude. Screening to be followed or screening to be maintained during the training, high altitude training. The SpO2 to be monitored, and we have to see, one can monitor difficulty of respiration or any other complication during the high altitude training. And coach must have the proper idea about the athlete before embarking the high altitude training for their benefits. So this is all about the high altitude training and high altitude physiology, physiological implications, and types of training of hypoxic chamber.